Okay, then let's get going. So, it's going to be quite a relaxed session today. I'd really like lots of questions, if at all possible. There are a lot of slides, but I'm not going to go through each and every one of them with you, because each slide is a kind of cheat sheet for the certain markets that I want to get you thinking about. So, remembering where all this started, with the kind of Trump's administration's change to their trade policy, obviously kicking off last year with the tariff regime, and then the removal of de minimis, and then the events over the last 72 hours or so on. And I think, albeit things have kind of wound down, which is fantastic, and that they needed to, they were reaching that kind of like heightened state. I think certainly for us here at Global Trade Department, what we want to get across to any business that interacts with us now is that there is kind of like a new world order appearing out there, and perhaps the historical relationships between countries maybe are not as reliable as they certainly were in the past. Certainly the UK and the US has been a little bit volatile. And I think, we could go back even a little bit further. We could go back to Brexit, really, and we could say, well, before Brexit, we were a nation that largely relied on trading within our bloc. And that's why so many businesses struggled after the end of the transition period, because all of a sudden they weren't dealing with local supplies, they were dealing with import and export, and they've had to ramp up their skill set and their knowledge really quite quickly. And I think even after Brexit, we're still relying on the countries that we've always traded with, and we're not always that bold to be reaching out to those markets that perhaps we haven't dealt with before for whatever reason. Maybe it's a lack of confidence, maybe it's perceived barriers to entry, whatever it is. But having worked in international trade for 30 years now, and as my colleagues from DBT who are on this call as well will tell you, for every barrier there's a workaround, there's always a way to push through. And I think it's never been more important than it is today to start spreading our risk amongst different export markets, so that, when these kind of hiccups occur, they don't have that dramatic impact on our revenues for our individual businesses, but then also on the UK economy as well, because the vast majority of you joining this call today are probably SMEs. And collectively, we are the backbone of the UK economy. So our ability to trade internationally is massively important. So what I want to get you thinking about today is the world beyond the US, but also importantly, beyond the EU. So I'm not going to be talking about the US or the United States of America, let's say. I'm going to be talking about Canada, but I'm not going to be talking about the USA or the EU today. This is all about looking beyond. Now, some of you might have dabbled and dipped your toes in those markets already. You may already be exporting. They may be on your plan to explore. I'm conscious that the kind of companies that we come across come from all different walks of life. You may be services, you may be product based, you may be micro, you may be small, medium, large size business, and we're always blown away by the sheer variety of businesses that come across us and seek out support from us. So some of it will be a little bit generic, and what I would say is we've got some support options towards the end that feel free to take advantage of if you want more of a deep dive into your own business, if that makes sense. So without further ado, I'm going to kick off. Like I say, there's a lot of slides. You will get a copy of the slides and you'll get a link to the recording, because we are recording today, as always. And so more or less focus on what I'm saying rather than reading the slides, because some of them are a little bit busy. So just by means of a brief agenda, we're going to just, it might be revision for some of you might be hearing it for the first time, but we're going to talk about, what criteria do you look for in that ideal export market. So when you're looking to break into a new export market, what are the kind of secret ingredients that go some way to guaranteeing your success, your sustained success in that market? And then I'm going to do a deep dive into certain countries And I've broken them up via their territory. So we'll look at, like I say, Canada and North American, APAC, Asia, Africa, and so on. And like I say, each market that I've listed has its own slide, its own kind of like cheat sheet. And I'll give some examples of what's on that slide and why it's important. And then we'll talk a little bit about additional considerations for markets that perhaps aren't as culturally aligned to us or aren't as aligned from a linguistic perspective. So there's a very clear reason why we trade so much with the EU and why we trade so much with the US. The EU, obviously, we were part of a trading bloc, and culturally we're quite closely aligned. And with the US, obviously English speaking, it's the natural next step beyond trading within our trading bloc as was. So when you look beyond those two vast territories, you come across different cultures, different languages, different ways of doing things, different norms, and so on. And it's really important that we're cognizant of those so that we make the best impression when penetrating that market. And believe you me, even some of the big brands have been known to get it wrong when investing millions in terms of penetrating a new market. So even the big brands can come a cropper, if you like. So we're going to cover off some of the considerations for those markets that perhaps we're not so culturally aligned with, are further afield, and we haven't done business with previously. Okay. So I wanted to cover off really kind of like those core criteria. So what are we looking for when we look at that ideal prospective export market? Well, the first one obviously is that strong and growing demand. So, is there an export market has high potential when it has a large or a really fast growing consumer base or customer base? That's a given. Obviously, if you've been able to identify clear demand gaps that local producers can't fill or other international companies that are within that market aren't filling. We're seeing with some of the markets that I'll cover off today, a very fast rising middle class and an increase in purchasing power. That's obviously another tick for a market. And then, is there growth in your specific sector, if you like, so construction, retail, agri-food, ICT, or so on. If that market has a particular growth area that aligns itself with what you do from a product or service perspective, then obviously that's another tick. So that kind of strong and growing demand, that's probably one of the most important indicators, when that demand in that country is outstripping supply, outstripping domestic supply, then you can fill that gap. So that's the first thing that we're looking for. And believe you me, the world is a big place and markets are out there that aren't as developed as ours. So there's huge opportunity for SMEs to carve their niche in those markets. And as I always say to our clients, if we're not doing it, some other country in the globe has their SMEs targeting those markets. So we've got to get a little bit better, a little bit bolder about reaching beyond the US and the EU. Obviously, another tick in the box, and those of you that have joined my webinars before will be very familiar with me talking about regulation as being a non-tariff barrier. And that, to me, that can often be a greater barrier to market entry than the actual tariffs, which, one of the reasons we're having this discussion today is because of the Trump administration and their imposition of tariffs. So you want to be looking for a market that has kind of low or at least manageable market barriers, because those markets represent the least friction to penetrate and do business in. So obviously you're looking for either, if there isn't a free trade agreement in place, then, are the tariffs that are being charged for your product in that market, are they relatively low? Ideally, you want to be looking for a preferential trade agreement in place, so whereby your goods will be imported into the destination market without any duty applied or a reduced rate of duty. And you'll be delighted to know that the majority of markets that I'm talking to you about today have free trade agreements in place. The UK has been working at pace to kind of replicate the preferential trade landscape that we had as part of the EU. Some of them are follow-on agreements, kind of continuity agreements. Some of them have been negotiated from scratch, but we are starting to see a real growth in our preferential trade landscape, and we need to be capitalizing on that. So a lot of the markets I'm going to talk to you about today, you will be able to benefit very likely from the free trade agreement, and therefore have your goods imported without any duty. You obviously want to know that the customs procedures are relatively predictable and straightforward. Most of the markets that I'm talking to you about today obviously subscribe to the World Customs Organization and the World Trade Organization. So everything that we do here in the UK in terms of our customs procedures, they will be replicating as well. So there's nobody doing anything particularly strange. There might be some nuances. So for the Middle East markets, those markets that make up part of the United Arab League of Markets, they insist on having a specific certificate of origin, which we'll cover off when we talk about those markets. But by and large, where you have standard goods, so they're not what we call goods that have special requirements placed on them. So you're not dealing with, say, food products or products that need any specific certification, then you'll be able to export to these markets, broadly speaking, with your commercial invoice, your packing list, and your export declaration, which corresponds to the import declaration that will be made when the goods clear customs in that target market. So I'm talking about customs authorities that pretty much follow our norms, and that would be another tick in the box as well. Obviously, transparent regulatory frameworks are really important. Now, the beauty, and this comes home to roost when I bang on about EU regulation to you quite regularly, in many respects, the beauty of aligning ourselves to EU regulation, that is very much the gold standard globally. So a lot of the markets that I'm talking to you about today will be either subscribing to EU regulation themselves or forming their own kind of like equivalent that will have a level of harmony with the standards that you're complying with to deal with your product domestically here in the UK and also ship it to the EU. So all of these markets have very transparent regulatory frameworks. And then, you know, we want to be looking at having relatively low kind of what I call non-tariff barriers. So, you know, not too much by means of labeling and standards conformity and assessments and so on, you know. Sometimes with the Middle Eastern markets as well, they can insist on export shipment inspections before goods are shipped. That's usually kind of big bulk cargo, you know, when you're shipping in container loads or so on, they might insist on an inspection beforehand. That's very much a nuance for the Middle Eastern countries. But then there are a wealth of companies out there that will undertake that work for you. And then obviously, as I'm talking about those kind of like tariffs and having that friction-free access, where there is a free trade agreement in place or some kind of economic prosperity agreement in place, then that goes without saying, that's going to be, you know, another tick in the box for that particular market. The whole thing about, because some of these markets I'm talking to you about today, I would have classified those as emerging markets. You know, there's markets that aren't quite as industrialized as ours or not quite as advanced in their export strategy as we are, for example. And sometimes those markets can have a history of kind of, you know, political unrest or economic uncertainty, and maybe their legal structure and their environment isn't as advanced as ours. So that can be something that you really need to understand as well. So, you know, export markets work and thrive when there's reliable contract enforcement. You know, when you have contracts with your customers and you know which jurisdiction they sit under, and if there's any kind of, you know, upset in the relationship, you know that you're kind of covered. Obviously, where political unrest or social unrest arises, then that can lead to currency volatility. That all of this stuff is manageable. You know, some of you might be aware of hedging and all that kind of stuff to kind of protect yourself against exchange rate fluctuations. For every risk that a country poses, there is a way of overcoming that risk, and quite often the riskier markets have the greatest yield and the greatest dividend. So there's always a way of protecting your business against any of these kind of like what we would class risks as. Obviously markets where policy changes are unpredictable, you know, as we've seen with the US, the trade policy has been a little bit unpredictable there, then that may make you think, actually, you know, I'll park that market until I've got a little bit more experience in that territory, for example. But you obviously want markets, your export market, to be one where the rule of law is strong and is transparent. And when you have that kind of stability, it reduces the risk, it reduces the cost to serve that market, and obviously as a result of that, your margins increase accordingly as well. You really want that efficient logistics and infrastructure. And if we were having this conversation maybe 10 years ago, some of the markets that I'm going to mention to you today, I probably wouldn't have included in this slide deck because they didn't have the infrastructure. They hadn't had that foreign direct investment that they've had over the last 10 years. But you really want those efficient logistics and infrastructure, because that reduces the cost of getting the product to your customer in that market. So, you know, where your export market, you can identify that, you know, they've got major ports and airports, they've got good, strong road and rail networks and distribution networks and so on. And obviously, if you're dealing with food or anything that needs a specific kind of chilled environment for transport, then you need to know that they've got a reliable cold chain for kind of like agri-food products and so on. You want to make sure that they've got that efficient last mile delivery. So, you know, as the exporter, you might be able to get the product, let's say it's going by sea freight, you might be able to get the product to the port in the country of destination, but can you be guaranteed that it gets from the port to your customer in a reliable way? And importantly, some of you on the call today may be relying on postal networks. We know from when Trump removed the de minimis threshold, when was it now? I think it was August, I think it was. Time goes so fast. We learned just how many of you rely on the postal network. So to service, if you're selling the same kind of product into a new export market, then you want to know that the postal service is reliable as well, in the same way as we rely on Royal Mail, on La Poste, Deutsche Post, and so on. And obviously, the more reliable the infrastructure is, and the more reliable the kind of logistics setup is, then that has a positive impact on your landed cost. It can reduce the risk of spoilage from perhaps product that maybe is susceptible to perishing. If it's food, for example, it can spoil if it's not delivered within a certain time frame. Obviously, that adds a cost to you. So you want that reliability of logistics and infrastructure. And obviously, that's speed to market, right? Because one of your USPs in the UK, you might be, well, one of my USPs is I guarantee 24-hour delivery, or I guarantee that my client's going to get it within this time frame. Our USPs in our domestic market don't always correlate or don't always translate exactly into USPs for our export markets. So if your speed of delivery is something that you pride yourself on and you want to be able to promise your export customers that same thing, then you need to know that you've got those logistic partners that can deliver that speed to market for you as well. Good cultural and customer fit. So obviously a good export market and an easy export market is one where you understand kind of like the consumer preferences or the business customer preferences. You understand their purchasing habits, the process that they go through to make their decisions and so on. You understand, you know, the kind of product formats that are familiar in that market. So I'll give you an example. I started my export journey 30 years ago, like I say, working for ICI, and we had established size tins that we would sell our paint in, thinking that we could just basically replicate that over in the EU. We couldn't, because they had a different set of size tins. They worked on different sizes. So it's understanding what product format that the market is working with, and whether or not your product needs to be adapted to suit the customer's expectations. You know, what are the packaging norms? What are the local buying behaviors? You know, where do consumers go to learn about new products? Where do business customers find out about new products that you might have? Understanding how they gauge information about brands, and how you can influence their brand perception. How elastic is their purchasing power? You know, so what's their willingness to pay like, and so on. And where you've got markets with similar tastes, or shared cultural ties, they can be easier to penetrate. So that's why we've been so familiar with dealing with the EU and the US, because it's easier. But that's not to say that, you know, we can't expand beyond that with a little bit more, to a certain extent, desktop research, we would call it, understanding the market that you want to break into. And making sure that, you know, your product, your service can be adapted, and that you understand kind of like the local norms and the whole purchasing process that your prospective clients are going to go through. Obviously, established competition. Some people will say, oh, there's competition there already. Competition's a good thing, because competition proves that there's a market, and competition comes in different forms in international trade. You might have a domestic producer, so, you know, established in that market. They may have a competitive product, or similarly, you might have one of your competitors that you've come across in other markets. They may be established over in that market in terms of their exporting to that market as well. So competition comes in different forms, but I always think it's a good thing, because it proves that there's a demand for your product if somebody's already there trying to do it. You obviously want to understand whether, you know, the quality of the local supply. So obviously, if there's weak or inconsistent quality of supply in that market, then that's a, you know, a big tick for you to get in there with your quality goods and seize the market share. You also want to be looking at markets, and I've got some in the slides today that are dependent on imports. So they have high import dependency, and there's a number of them, especially in the Middle East, where they have no alternative but to import goods from outside. So that would be another tick as well. And then opportunities for clear differentiation. So where you can look at what that market has already, and you can identify where your niche is there. So, you know, is it that you are particularly innovative? Is it that you have a higher quality product? Is it that you have a sustainability story, which is gaining a lot of traction, there's no doubt, globally? You know, what is your niche going to be? And then obviously that shapes your messaging as well. And obviously, where you come across a market that's kind of entrenched in incumbents, that becomes more difficult to penetrate. So you would probably be looking at an alternative market, especially if you don't have the deep reserves or the kind of financial backing to throw a ton of marketing at it. You want to initially be going for some low-hanging fruit to kind of test the water and feel your way around initially. Again, when we talk about strong import reliance, like I say, there's a few markets that do rely on imports, and that's a huge tick in the box. Okay, so where imports already make up a big part of supply, where they've got domestic production that is limited or is maybe in decline, or where buyers, be they consumers or business customers, they're just familiar with overseas brands, right? That's just what they buy, without even questioning it. We see this a lot with machinery, chemicals, agri-food and consumer goods, where the brand value is so significant that the consumer is just becomes so familiar with importing those products and doesn't even question it. And then ease of doing business. So, you know, ideally you want your export market to be one where, you know, like I said, customs norms are transparent, regulations transparent. If you are at the point where you want to expand into that market and establish some kind of legal entity in that market, you want that registration to be simple, whether you're establishing a branch or a subsidiary. You want that transparent and simple registration process. You also want, if you're a little bit further back in your growth, you want to know that if you want to take the channel approach and you want to appoint agents or distributors or resellers, you want to know that they're reliable and that you can gather enough information about them to convince yourself that they're creditworthy, that they've got good pedigree and they've got no nasties kind of like hiding in their closets, if you like. You want to make sure that there are clear payment systems, and you want to make sure that those countries have what we call low levels of corruption and high levels of intellectual property protection as well. So many businesses will say to us, I don't have any IP. And actually, when you go through it and you say, well, you know, do you have a trading name? You know, do you have this? Do you have that? And very quickly they start to realize, actually, I do have intellectual property, and the damage that could be done to my brand if that was infringed upon is significant. So you want to make sure that, you know, the market that you're going into, if you need to invest in IP protection, then, you know, there's a straightforward way of doing it and the safeguards are in place. Now, when I talk about the ease of doing business, there's a fantastic index that has been in place for the longest time. It's actually the World Bank. They used to call it the Ease of Doing Business Index, but it's now called the Business Ready or Be Ready Index. And that basically ranks countries according to the ease of doing business. So, you know, how transparent are their regulatory frameworks? How reliable are their public services? You know, what's their kind of operational efficiency like, and so on. I've included the ratings for each one of these countries on these scorecards because that gives you an indication of how business friendly that market is going to be to you exporting, or further on your journey, maybe establishing a presence in that market. The other metric that I've included as well, or the other rating or ranking that I've included, is the low corruption. Is all about low corruption. A lot of companies aren't aware, but we have the UK Bribery Act here in the UK, going back to 2010, and that has extraterritorial reach, meaning that you can be responsible for, or you can be prosecuted here in the UK for corruption that actually took place overseas. It has that extraterritorial reach. Now, you can insure your company against that and so on and so forth. But it's always better to look at countries that have very low levels of corruption because your risk is significantly reduced there anyway. So I've given those scores. They're basically, they go from 0 to 100, with 0 being highly corrupt and 100 being, you know, very, very clean. And then you want to look at the margin potential that the market offers. So a good export market is only going to be good if it or it's only going to be viable even if it guarantees your margins. So if you can establish export pricing that the market can support, you know, it doesn't look more expensive than the competition, it sits comfortably, after taking into account your landed costs, so all of the costs that it takes to get that product on the shelves in the destination market, and you still manage to get a margin at the end of that. You also want to make sure that it's a market that is not you know, subject to a lot of low discount pressure and so on. So you're going to be under constant pressure to apply discounts and cut, because that's quite often a race to the bottom. And you want a market that has reasonable logistics costs. So all of that wonderful logistics and infrastructure, you want to make sure that you're not paying through the roof for that stuff as well. And also markets that have predictable payment terms as well. So, you know, if you're in a B2B scenario and you're offering credit to your business customer, You don't want to be exporting to a market where the business customer, the norm is 90 days credit or 120 days credit. So it's important. There's tons of information out there to do desktop research on individual markets. You'd very quickly be able to get a feel for whether or not that market was going to be a good fit for you. Obviously, high demand plus high margins equals your ideal export market. And then you want to make sure finally that you've got that strategic alignment with your abilities. So I've called them your core competencies, your capabilities. So, your best export markets are going to be those that match your strengths. Okay, so, where your product or your service meets a clear need, where you have the kind of certifications or regulatory compliance that the market needs, the local market needs. Your production capacity can fulfill the demand. That's a big thing sometimes, because export, it can quite often be described as the long game, but quite often it can all of a sudden just go like that. And you have to have the capacity, or at least the ability, to find that extra capacity quite quickly potentially. And you need to understand, or you need to be confident that your know-how is sufficient to service that market. Now, you're not going to know everything at day one. So, it's important that you've got companies like ourselves, like DBT, that you can reach out to check certain things with. There is a ton of knowledge out there for international trade, and a ton of really good people that are always happy to have a conversation. I know some of my DBT colleagues will be on the call today. They're always happy to have a conversation to point you in the right direction, if you like. And obviously the other thing is that your brand position kind of resonates in the market, so you understand what your brand positioning is, and the market understands it. And just understand that a market might look fantastic on paper, but it might be wrong for you if the business fit isn't there. So it's really important to be quite frank with yourself and understand fully your core competencies and capabilities, and not be afraid to kind of say, actually, I'm not there yet. We call it export readiness. We used to do kind of reports on it. We used to do kind of like audits on companies for their export readiness. And quite often we used to have to say, you're not quite there yet. You don't have this in place or that in place. Give it another 3 months, 6 months, so on. Anyway, I digress. So I'm going to cover off one of these slides because they're very wordy and there's a whole ton of them. And the idea is that it gives you a bit of a cheat sheet for each of the markets that I think you ought to be looking at. And I'm not going to go through all of them. The first one is Canada. What I've done is I've given you just the bog standard kind of information. So we're looking at the size of the economy, the growth that it's experiencing. What you will find is that some of what we would have referred to as the emerging markets, they experience far higher annual growth in terms of GDP than perhaps the more developed markets, like the US, like the EU, like the UK, and so on. I've broken down the demographics. Demographics are really important because they can give you an indication as to what the purchasing power is in that market. So, if you have a very aging population, which I think Japan has, and really the UK has as well, then those people are probably in their twilight years, and they're in their kind of like retirement stage, and they're not necessarily the ones that are spending a huge amount of money than if you were looking at a market where they have the majority of their population are kind of like working age, or particularly young, and that's where we're seeing this emerging middle class and this high disposable income. I've actually given the disposable income, at least in brackets, for each of these markets. And then you remember I was talking about that World Bank Business Ready. So you can see Canada here at 72.52 out of 100. That's actually a really attractive business environment. So based on all of the research that the World Bank has done, Canada scores really highly in terms of having transparent regulation, good public services, all that kind of stuff. Obviously, it's a fantastic preferential trade agreement in place. There's actually two. So we have a continuity agreement that was struck just before the transition period or just after the transition period after Brexit. But Canada is also part of the CPTPP alongside the United Kingdom as well. So we've got kind of like two trade agreements in place. And then the big de minimis thing, because de minimis I think is slowly but surely going to become a thing of the past, but it's obviously been a hot topic. Canada does still have a de minimis threshold. So those of you on the call today that are dealing in relatively low value goods and you're using postal networks, you would be able to benefit from that de minimis, which obviously we don't have in the US anymore, and the EU is removing theirs and the UK is removing its de minimis as well. Important that you know whether you're in the B2C field or the B2B field. It's really important that you know, okay, what are the platforms out there? So, in the UK, we're familiar with Amazon, eBay, Etsy, Frere, and so on. But what are those platforms in that target market? Well, Amazon is always going to feature, quite up there, but it will be the localized Amazon version. So it's Amazon Canada. But then what are the other platforms that you as an e-commerce seller might need to understand a bit more about and potentially market via? And then what kind of marketing resonates with the consumer there? So, so much of it now is going towards user-generated content. And, with the emergence of TikTok over the last few years, that kind of like whole influencer thing is massive. And we see that across all the territories that I'm talking about, really. And then I've just given you an understanding of what are the kind of like top consumer focused imports in Canada. Now, bearing in mind, don't be disheartened if your particular product doesn't appear on there, because we don't always have that granularity of data when it comes to our exports to a certain market. I kind of wish I could, and maybe one day I might go and try and do that or find out where I can get it. So don't be disheartened. You should always take a look at some of these platforms, like the e-commerce platforms that I've mentioned there, and understand what the products are there that are being sold. And that'll give you a flavour as to whether or not, there's a particular opportunity for yours. Then if you're in the B2B side of things, obviously your approach to marketing is different, your platforms are slightly different, and it won't necessarily be the way that you sell to your business clients here in the UK. So it's important that you understand so that you're hitting the ground running, understanding, how they do things, what their norms are, what they expect from you, and so on. And then I've given, again, kind of like those business focused imports as well. Okay, so that's Canada. And I really wanted to kind of show you the layout so that you can navigate the rest and you understand what I'm talking about. So Canada has, the most important thing is Canada has a really good ranking for business readiness and a really good score for corruption. It's a relatively clean market to do business in. And then I told you there was quite a lot. So we've got Japan, another trade agreement in place, thanks to our DBT people. We've got Singapore. Again, we've got a trade agreement in place with Singapore. We've got South Korea. We've got another trade agreement in place with South Korea. We've got a trade agreement in place with Australia. And if you just follow when I talked to you before about that, they all follow the same format, so you'll be able to navigate what these are. New Zealand, trade agreement in place. Remembering we don't have a trade agreement with the US. So, we've had those tariffs imposed upon our imports. These trade agreements in place, most product will be imported into that destination market at a reduced or a zero rate of duty. The ones that are sometimes a little bit more complicated are like food products and so on, where they might be subjected to quotas and things like that. But if you're dealing just within standard goods, then they should enter the market with a zero rate of duty, which is fantastic because it reduces your landed cost, which means that you can either inflate your margin or you can discount your product and make your product more competitive in the market. It's a no-brainer, and I know you all understand that. We've got India again. The UK-India trade agreement isn't enacted at the moment, but it's coming. Here's an example. So India doesn't have the best corruption score. So you can see, you'll you'll get a flavour for this when you start going through all the cards. We've got Vietnam that is subject to our old trade agreement that was done after Brexit, but then they're also in the CPTPP. We've got Indonesia. Now, Indonesia we don't have a trade agreement with them at the moment, or we have what we call a unilateral trade agreement. So they're on the developing countries trading scheme that the UK run. It's a little bit like the EU's general systems of preference scheme. It means that we import their goods at a reduced or a zero rate of duty, but they don't, but they apply duty to ours. It's a unilateral preferential trade deal. The Philippines, again, we don't have a trade agreement. Thailand, we don't have a trade agreement currently. South Africa, we do have a trade agreement with. Nigeria, we don't currently. They're another example of a unilateral trade agreement whereby we don't apply duty on their goods that we import into the UK. We have a trade agreement with Kenya. We have a trade agreement with Ghana. We have the old UK-Chile Association Agreement, but then Chile's also part of the CPTPP. You're getting the flavour here. We've got quite a good preferential landscape to deal with, which is really important. Brazil, again, we don't have a trade agreement with Brazil at the minute. We work under World Trade Organization rules. And again, we import their goods without any duty applied. We have a trade agreement with Colombia. It's part of a trade agreement with Peru and Ecuador. We don't have a trade agreement with the UAE at the minute, but it's part of our negotiations with the Gulf Cooperation Council. So a number of the Middle Eastern markets I've actually covered it here, actually Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia and UAE are all part of that free trade agreement negotiation. So in time, the Middle Eastern markets, like I mentioned at the very beginning, can be slightly different around certificates of origin, even when the product, you're not kind of proving UK origin, it could be third country origin, because the Middle East won't import anything of Israeli origin, for example. So they always want to know the origin of the product from not a statistical, but almost like a political reason. Saudi, again, is part of that GCC negotiation, as is Qatar. Kuwait, you can see these have all got de minimis thresholds as well. And that's it. So I don't know how many we've got there, but they're broken down into kind of like their main regions. Take some time to look over them. And they're kind of like a cheat sheet to get you started, about thinking about your product. So when we're thinking about, and I've kind of alluded to it throughout this, when we're thinking about opportunities with markets outside of our core kind of EU and US, there are some specific things that we have to consider. So I've kind of listed them here as market access and localization. So where you haven't got experience in that market, you might benefit from appointing, instead of trying to sell directly to that market, you might benefit from appointing a local representative or an importer or a distributor or something that knows that market and knows those norms and can advise you. I mean, I've worked with distributors over the last 30 years. I've worked with good ones. I've worked with amazing ones, actually, and I've worked with not so good ones. But in terms of your feet on the ground and your eyes and ears, I'm getting showed my time ticket now to kind of wrap up. They're brilliant in terms of feet on the ground, your eyes and ears. They advise you on all sorts of stuff to do with regulation, product adaptation, and so on. And with some of these markets where they are kind of culturally different, and they're a bit of a step beyond what you're used to, then they can be really good. And obviously also, they can help you quite often grow faster than if you're selling direct into that market. You need to really be aware of the cultural norms and the kind of sensitivities. So forgive me if I'm preaching to the converted here and you know all of this stuff, but right the way down to symbols, colours, imagery, certain language can be deemed inappropriate in certain markets. So, a famous one was a very high-end kitchen manufacturer that was trying to break into the Middle East, and they were using the same imagery that they'd used throughout Europe and the UK, but they had a bottle of wine on the kitchen island. Well, obviously they were trying to sell into countries where alcohol is not consumed. So it's kind of like being aware of the social norms, the cultural norms, and making sure that you go that extra mile in terms of researching what's acceptable and what's not. Also taking into account, religious considerations. So, if it's food, halal, kosher, if you're, right the way down to fasting and so on. Obviously, these markets have different holidays, different festivals that they celebrate and so on. Even right the way down to, what are the gender norms? What are the kind of family dynamics? What's the social hierarchy like? It can vary differently, and that's, to be honest, that diversity is what makes international trade so magically interesting. Is actually when you're going into these markets, which you will find yourself doing at some point, and you're navigating those kind of like different ways of doing things and those different personalities, and right the way down to, I think I spent about a week in Singapore doing about 25, I think we did 25 meetings over the course of 5 days. We literally got off the plane straight into our first meeting. We were wrecked when we got home after that, but it shocked me. I thought I understood the market, but it shocked me that actually the most productive conversations happened over eating, over lunch, which, being a Brit, I quite often kind of skip lunch and we'll work through it or something. But actually, they want to take, Singapore is very much kind of like Chinese population. They want to go to lunch. They want to learn about you. They want to learn about your family. They want to learn about your hobbies. They want to know about you, because if they trust you, then they'll trust your product, and everything kind of like runs from there. You really need to understand kind of like the communication and the marketing as well. So, understand your tone, your humor. Messaging that is perceived as being quite funny here may not translate quite so well in that local market. Understand who the local influencers are, what media channels are, and what digital platforms, which hopefully I've given you a kind of bit of a help guide there. And then, what are the language requirements? Can you get away with English, which some of the markets that we've gone through today, certainly the business language is English, but quite often consumers will always want to be marketed to or sold to in their native tongue, and that's totally understandable, right? That's how we are also. You also want to understand, what's the payment risk or the currency exposure. So with some of these markets, a lot of the big companies where they're dealing with big transactions, they'll get involved in letters of credit and documentary credit and so on, just because it's an easier way of guaranteeing payment. But you want to understand how easy it is to get a grip on how creditworthy your customer is. If you are exposed to any kind of like risk, then what safeguards can you put in place? So do you have any hedging needs? Do you need to purchase currency in advance? All that kind of stuff. And there's tons of different insurances and all sorts out there that can cover you for this kind of stuff. Intellectual property I've mentioned already. So, if you do have intellectual property, then look into it. I don't know whether it's still around now, but I know that Innovate were offering funding for, it might not even be available now, it's a while back, but they were offering funding for IP audits, because so many companies, like I say, don't recognise that they've got IP, and they go through everything that your company does, everything your company has, and you'd be surprised what you've got. Where you do have it, for the sake of registering a trademark or whatever, it's definitely worth doing. And then, like I said, contract jurisdiction, so understanding, the local legal system, how reliable it is. Ideally, you want contracts under law of England and Wales, if at all possible, if you're able to negotiate that, or your terms and conditions should be, as the exporter, under the jurisdiction of the Court of England and Wales. But so much of this stuff is often up to, at least in a B2B scenario, it's up to negotiation, really. And then you want to understand your internal capacity. So not just your know-how, but kind of like, you know, do you need any cultural competence training? Do you need to employ any local language skills? And how easily would you be able to adapt your product and its packaging and its messaging if you had to? And then market volatility. So, you know, in this ever-changing world, I think markets are quite volatile anyway, but you know, there's markets where perhaps well, say Venezuela, for example, we had no idea that the Trump administration was going to do what it actually did, or at least I didn't necessarily see it coming. But what impact has that had on you know, kind of like currency and shocks and so on. But obviously as well, we're starting to see with climate change, more and more natural disasters or climate related disruptions that can have an impact. How can you safeguard against that? You know, are you selling into a market that at a certain time of the year is, you know, prone to massive flooding and so on? And you just have to build that into your whole strategy and build in that potential supply chain disruption into your strategy and mitigating your risks. Now, I do want to move to questions, so I'm just going to cover a couple of things here. There's a few things coming through in terms of available support. So we're going to be doing 3-minute long, following on from this, understanding I've probably thrown a lot of stuff at you, and you're going to go away and read these slides and think, oh, you know, where do I go now? So we're going to be doing 3-minute long educational videos. We're going to push those out via our YouTube channel. They'll be on things like, at the minute, we're thinking, what goes on a commercial invoice? How do you classify your product? Make sure you've got the right commodity code. How do you determine the origin of your goods? All that kind of stuff. Just 3-minute, easy to consume, she says. I'm getting better. Kind of kind of like educational snippets that just help you get that little bit more fay with your compliance, both with customs and regulation. Our GTD Fast Track is now live. That is kind of like an interactive full market launch roadmap. So if you go away and digest what you've been given today and you think, right, you know what it is, I'm going to break into Brazil, then all we need is your company size, your commodity code, and obviously Brazil being your export market. And we basically provide you with an interactive, detailed how-to guide, encapsulating everything from the market research all the way through to product adaptation, regulatory and customs compliance. Global Trade Clinic, we're always happy to jump on a 15-minute free of charge call. Honestly, we would much rather just have a call with you and put to bed any concerns you have so you can get on your merry way and export more than have you sit there scratching your head thinking, I don't know where to go next. We do have some support packages. Most of our clients are actually now booking maybe half a day's consultancy, and we just call that off in 15-minute increments. If it's not used up within the 12 months, it just rolls over. But it means actually what's quite exciting is finally we're becoming that, what I always wanted for this business was to be an extension of a business's own team. So we become kind of like that specialist part of their team. And then finally, for my fantastic colleagues from DBT that are on today, DBT has a wealth of information. I had hoped that one of my colleagues would be here today, but it didn't work out. So I just wanted to give a quick plug. So they've got their new website, business.gov.uk. It's got all of their free domestic support on there, and it's also got international trade support. If you're a business that's generating over a certain amount, then you may be entitled to your own international trade advisor. But failing that, they have a help desk. They've got a wealth of videos. Some of you might have even come across Global Trade Department by watching us present on behalf of DBT on their Export Academy program. So, oh, honestly, you're familiar with that slide, and I'm just going to stop there because